Hi, Chris Morris here with you, taking you through a study of a database management system. In this case, we're looking at Oliver. Oliver is a piece of software developed by Softlink, and essentially it is a library management system. If we were to classify it as a type of system, we would call it a transaction processing system, or TPS, as it carries out transactions via the borrower. The borrower, being a student or a teacher, can borrow out resources from the library, and this system looks after the attribution of a resource to a particular borrower, and the ability to run things like overdue notices and late notices. All those sorts of things are carried out by this particular system. One of the tasks I asked you to complete was to develop a context diagram and a data flow diagram representing this system. We'll go in and have a look at the two types of diagrams that are used or can be used to represent a system. The context diagram is essentially the first level or zero level of a DFD, or a data flow diagram, where the circle represents the entire system. The system in this case is Oliver, so we don't break it up into processes. The entire system, its entire workings, is represented by the circle. The square is an external entity. An external entity is either the source or recipient of data from the system. So the librarian would be an obvious external entity in this example. The last shape or item used in a context diagram for Oliver would be data flows. So obviously data flows between external entities and the system itself. Obviously these need to be labelled, what type of data is flowing between the external entity and the system. This may look a bit confusing to start with, but let me go through this and explain essentially what this is all about. So we'll start in the top left hand corner, and my recommendation in terms of constructing a context diagram and a data flow diagram is to simply list all of the external entities first. The obvious one is the system, that's quite easy. And then you list all the data flows that will occur. So we'll start in the top left hand corner, the student or the teacher. They request to loan a resource from the library, so that goes through the Oliver Library system. They present a borrower card or an ID of the student. Many students come to the library and forget their library card, so the librarian or the library assistant has to identify them, and that's assisted via the Oliver system via the use of a photograph. Once the student or teacher have been identified and registered by Oliver as a borrower, they can be approved or disapproved for the loan, and therefore they can be provided the resource and the due date in which it's back. So you can see data is flowing from the external entity to the system, from the system back to the external entity. We'll go to the librarian and the library staff. From the librarian to the system itself is the customization of Oliver, and the librarian has scope to actually make the front page of Oliver and various parts of the system tailor-made to suit the college. Obviously they also add data to Oliver itself, including the cataloguing of new resources. Obviously loans that are carried out are entered into the system. Overdues requested and stock take data is all fed into this library system, so you can see that's a flow from the external entity to the system, and the flowing back to the external entity is updated resources appear in the catalogue, overdue lists, and obviously feedback on the screen of different things that are carried out during the transaction. The Catholic Education Office are also an external entity because this application, Oliver, is actually run as a web-based application. So they actually host Oliver for the college, and so therefore every time the librarian carries out a request, data is flowing from the school or the college to the CEO data service, and data is then flowing back to the system. I've put down finally SoftLink, who are the creators of the software. Obviously Oliver wouldn't exist without their creation. So you can see that the context diagram consists purely of external entities generally around the outside, the system in the center as the circle, and the flow of data. The next level is the data flow diagram. Now the data flow diagram is pretty much the same shapes, however with slight variations, and one additional one, which is the data storage. I often call it the right hand missing rectangle. The slight variation here is that the circle no longer becomes the whole system, but is representative of the processes that are involved in an action being taken out with the system. And I'll give you an example here in a moment. External entities are still represented by squares, data flow via the labeled arrows, and data storage via that right hand missing rectangle. Okay, again, it may appear confusing, but I'll just talk you through this, and hopefully it makes some sort of sense. Okay, so we start off with the student or teacher who presents to the library to borrow an item. Let's assume that they've already picked out their item, they've got it in their hot little hand, and they're about to now borrow it out. So they present their card or their ID to the librarian or the library staff. What the librarian or the library staff then do is either scan the card or verify the identification of the borrower. You can see this is represented by a process, and the data that flows from that process is a barcode or type name, and that is obviously checked against the Oliver database, which is obviously a data store. Now, once the code or the barcode or the type name is entered in, then the database responds with a allow or disallow loan to the librarian. So the next step that the librarian then carries out is to scan the resource, and every resource in the library is given a unique code or barcode, which is entered into the database when the library receives it. This process is called accessioning. So every item is accessioned, which means that it has an individual entry within the database, so that when the librarian then scans the resource, it obviously is recognized in the database, and it then sends a message back to the librarian that the resource is verified or not verified, the fact that it exists or it doesn't exist. So now we've got a process of scanning the card, the database replies, scanning the book, the database replies to the librarian. What happens next? Well, the item, the resource, book, CD, DVD, laptop, whatever, has to be now linked to the borrower. So in a sense, it's matching two barcodes up with one another in a transaction table. So you can see this process here, link resource to borrower. So the borrower ID matches the resource ID and is stored in the database, and then that is then displayed to the librarian that in fact I have borrowed out a book or a CD or a DVD or a laptop, etc. Once the librarian is satisfied that that transaction has been attributed to me, then the borrowed resource and the card is returned to the student or the teacher, and they're told of the due date. Or if the loan is disallowed for overdue reasons, or they haven't paid a fine or whatever, then the loan is denied and that's sent back to the student. So you can see that there's a logic that occurs throughout the data flow diagram. I could get into more detail in relation to the Oliver database, but I'll keep it as simple as possible for the moment. Hope this little explanation about context and data flow diagrams in relation to Oliver has been worthwhile for you. Thanks.